Okay, good morning everyone. Shalom Aleichem, Bruchim Habayim. So today we begin a very important series. In preparation for Shavas B'Tammuz, we discussed in past years a great revelation of Rabbi Chanan Wasserman, Hashem Yimkom Damai, that there are two great tragedies in the history of the Jewish people: the Mechiras Yosef and the Chet HaEgel. And both of these sins are considered preserved for all generations, meaning in every generation there is some punishment from Mechiras Yosef, which Rabbi Chanan uncovered. In every generation there are blood libels, because as a punishment from Mechiras Yosef, because we committed the first blood libel. We took Yosef's tunic, we dipped it in blood, and we said, Hakyarna, is this Haksoines Bincha? Is this the tunic of your son? So we created the first blood libel. So in every generation the Jewish people suffer from blood libels. And you say, really? In every generation? Yeah, all you need to do is every single day in the news when they accuse the Israeli army of being brutal, or they accuse them of indiscriminately killing people. They're the most moral army in the entire world, in the history of the world. That's a modern day blood libel. That's a punishment for Mechiras Yosef. And then Rabbi Chanan also uncovers that in every generation there is some remnant of Chet HaEgel, of the sin of the golden calf. And the phenomenon of the golden calf also appears in every generation. In every generation there is a false Mashiach. There will always be a person that people hinge their hopes on, or an ideology that people hinge their hopes on. One of the first episodes of Mashiach Sheker is an episode that, very shockingly, most learned Jews know absolutely nothing about. And it's very important to understand the background of the situation. And that is the story and the narrative of Bar Kochva. We're going to be spending a lot of time on this. There's a lot of information on this in the Gemara, also especially in the Yushalmi, in the Medrash. We don't know much about Bar Kochva himself, because in the end it was a great tragedy. But there is a particular detail that many are not aware of, and that is the time period that Bar Kochva took place in. Okay, we're talking about the emperor of Rome. When the Romans set out to destroy the second Beis HaMikdash, was originally Nero Caesar, and then he fled. So they appointed Vespasian, Aspasianus Caesar, and then he sent Titus to destroy the Beis HaMikdash. After him, his brother took over, Domitian. You had a Roman emperor, Trajan. You had a Roman emperor, Quietus, and followed by Adarianos Caesar. Adarianos Caesar, Hadrian. I'm sure you've heard the name Hadrian. Hadrian's reign was, if I'm not mistaken, approximately from the year 118 of the Common Era to 138. About 50 years after the destruction of the second Beis HaMikdash. Okay? Now Hadrian began his reign in a way where he wanted to show understanding and friendship to all nations, including the Jewish people. And he issued a stunning proclamation that you could stop 1,000 people. I would be surprised if even one would even know about this. Okay, we're talking now 50 years after the destruction of the second Beis HaMikdash. It's not so long ago, It's under 2,000 years ago. Okay, now take a look. This is Bereshis Rabbah, Parsha Samach Daled Ois Yud. Bimei Rabbi Yeshua ben Chananya. In the times of Rabbi Yeshua ben Chananya. Who's Rabbi Yeshua ben Chananya? He's one of the students of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was the leader of the Jewish people in the times of Churban Bayis Sheni. One of his 5 Talmidim was Rabbi Yeshua ben Chananya. What did we say about Rabbi Yeshua? What did Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai say about Rabbi Yeshua ben Chananya? Ashrei Yoiladatai. Yeah? Gozra Malchus Harasha Sheyibane Beis Hamikdash. The Roman emperor decreed that we should return and rebuild the second Beis HaMikdash. Do you know about that? That after the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed in the year 70 or so of the Common Era by Titus, about 50 years later, in the times of Yeshua ben Hananiah, the evil government, that's always a reference to Rome, Malchus is always a reference to Rome, decreed we should rebuild the Beis HaMikdash. By the way, one thing you see is that you could do it. If we're given license, that's all we need. And we could go build the Beis HaMikdash. This happened 50, now, the Medrash doesn't tell us who the Roman emperor was, because it wasn't relevant for Torah, but the Roman emperor was Hadrian, Adarianus Caesar. Okay? They decreed to rebuild the Beis HaMikdash. So now, there are two great tzaddikim that the Gemara Pesachim calls Harugei Lud. They were the martyrs of Lud. Their names were Pappus and Lilyanos. What did they do? Haishivu Pappus v'Lilyanos terapezin me'ako ad Antuchya. Now, what does that mean? That means the Jews have to leave now Cedarhurst, they have to leave Lawrence, they have to leave Muncie, they have to leave Lakewood, and they have to come back and rebuild the Beis HaMikdash. Who's going to want to do that? How are you supposed to? What are you going to do with your currency? You need banks. So they set up money changers, ad me'akoy ad Antuchya, from Syria to Akko, so that all the Jews could return and exchange their money. But what are you going to eat on the way? They set up kiosks. They wrote on it, Rabbi Shaya ben Rav Moshe, make a bracha over here. You could eat over here. They set up stations. They provided all of your needs. Uzlin Elaine Kusai. The Kuthians went. Now, who are the Kuthians? Kuthians were the early Christians, who were Jews, by the way. There was no difference between the early Christians and Jews. The only difference was whether you believed in Oisai Hosh. Va'amrin, and they said as follows. Now, the Medrash is paraphrasing a pasuk in Ezra, because obviously this did not happen. This pasuk was not said in this time, because this is 50 years later. But it's paraphrasing. Basically, the Kusians said, Yedia lehavel malka. The king needs to know. Dahadin karta meradita tispene. That if this rebellious city would ever be rebuilt, v'shuraya yishtachalon, and the walls established, minda beloy v'halach lo yisnon. The Jews ain't ever paying you any taxes. Bad idea. You think if you rebuild Jerusalem and rebuild the temple, the Jews are going to pay taxes? These are 4 kinds of taxes. Minda zu midas haaretz, real estate tax. Beloy zu perov girain, v'halach an geroitina, a head tax, different kinds of taxes. Don't expect to get any tax money from the Jews. So Adaryan's case said, what do you want me to do? I already told them they could return and rebuild the Beis HaMikdash. I can't rescind. What am I supposed to do? I already made the decree. Amrin lei. So these early Christians, they knew the deal. They said, no problem. You told them they could rebuild the Beis HaMikdash. Tell them you could rebuild the Beis HaMikdash. You just need to move everything 5 amos off. Tell them, they could go return and build the Beis HaMikdash. They just have to build it 5 amos off. As everybody knows, you can't even build a Mikdash 1 millimeter off. Halachically, the Kodesh HaKadosh has to be in this place, the Kodesh has to be in this place. So, and they're going to disband on their own. They're going to say, forget it on their own. This way they won't have any tinus on you, because they're going to say, you kept your word, and they're just going to forget the whole idea. Amrin lei, so the early Christians said, shlach va'amr lahain, send and tell them, o yeshanun yasei me asrei, either move it from the place, or yoisfin alei chamesh amin, or add 5 amos, or yivtzur minei chamesh amin, or detract 5 amos. Min garmei hoin inun chazur behen, and on their own they're going to retract. So now the Jews were distraught. The Jews were distraught. Here, can you imagine the hopes that, now they had some kind of tradition. They thought that just like the second Beis HaMikdash was rebuilt after 70 years, the third Beis HaMikdash would be built shortly after. So they had their hopes high, and now they're about to rebuild. And they know that Adaryanus is deliberating whether to make good on his word. Now, where did they gather? What's very interesting is, at this point in time, the Mesivta, throughout history, there was always a Mesivta, there was always a Nasi, and there was an Av Bezdin. Now, the leader of the Jewish people in this Tekufa was Rabbi Shua ben Chananya, the Talmid Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. He was not the Nasi, he was the Av Bezdin. Who was the Nasi? They couldn't make a Nasi, because the Romans had it out. They put a bounty on any leader from the Davidic dynasty. So they had to abandon the post of Nasi. So technically speaking, the Nasi would have been Reb Shimon ben Gamliel. However, he had to remain low-key, and he didn't assume the title Nasi, because he knew that it would be endangering his life. Rabbi Shua ben Chananya was the Av Bezdin. The Mesivta at this time in history was in Usha. All the Gemaras that we learned, let's say in Ksubis, about the Takanos of Usha, took place in this period of history, about 50 years after the Churban Beis HaMikdash. Rabbi Shua ben Chananya was the leader, and at this point in time, they had to stay away from all the big cities in Yehuda, for example, Yerushalayim. And the Mesivta was in the Galil, in Usha, in, so to speak, away from the main settlement. So the Jewish people gathered in an area called Beis Rimon. Okay? The community gathered in a valley called Beis Rimon. Kivan da Asun, when the news came to them that they would not be granted permission to rebuild the Beis HaMikdash, Kisavaya Sharoin Bachyan, they began to cry. What did they say? Bayin lemimrad amalchus. They wanted to rebel against the Malchus. Now, this is already 50 years after the destruction of the second Beis HaMikdash. If we remember, in the times of the second Beis HaMikdash, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai and the Chachamim told the Bar Yonim, do not rebel. Traditionally, the Chachamim were always against resistance. From the beginning of time, resistance was always frowned upon. There were times in history that the Chachamim endorsed it, but going back to the second Beis HaMikdash, the Chachamim told the Bar Yonim, do not resist. The Bar Yonim insist on resisting. So what the Bar Yonim did was they burnt down all the storehouses. Now again, 50 years later, the Jewish army was already, so to speak, strong enough that they felt confident that they would be able to rebel against the Roman government. And the Chachamim needed to do something fast, because the Chachamim felt this would be a ill-fated resistance. So what did they do? Bayin lemimrad al-malchusa. They wanted to rebel. Amrin, they said, Ya'oil chad barnash chakima. Let a smart Jew go up, vishadech tzibura, and persuade the tzibur to cool it off, not to resist. Who do they send? Amrin, Ya'oil Rabbi Shua ben Chananya. Let Rabbi Shua ben Chananya go up. To who is Kailoisitakia de Iraisa? He's a great sage. He gave the following drasha. He told a fable. He said, once upon a time there was a lion, and the lion was eating fish, and he got a bone. The lion got a bone stuck in his throat. So the lion said, whichever animal could come and dislodge the bone from my throat, he'll get a big prize. So the long-beaked heron came and said, I could do this. So he stuck his beak in the mouth of the lion, and he dislodged the bone, and the lion finally had relief. So the long-beaked heron said, no, it's payday. Right? The lion said, Amar called the Asay Mapik Le'ana Yav Le'agra. Whoever gets out the bone, I'm going to reward them. Asa Hadain Koirei, Mitzra'e, an Egyptian long-beaked heron came. The Moikare Arach, its beak is long. Yahiv Moikare V'apke, it took out the bone. Amar Lei, so the heron said, Havli Agri. Amar Lei, the lion said, get out of here. The biggest reward is you could go tell your friends you stuck your head in the mouth of a lion and you emerge unscathed. That's your reward. Your reward is you could boast. Yeah, you know who I am. I'm a bird. I even stuck my head in the mouth of a lion and nothing happened to me. That's your reward. So too said Rabbi Shua ben Chananya. You're going to start up with the lion. You better, Jews, boast, go around saying that you survived the Roman Empire. Okay? That is the backdrop of what we call the war at Beitar and the rise of Bar Kochva. So what I'm going to just share with you now is the account of Harav Avigdor Miller, Zechut Tzaddik Livracha, in his Sefer Am Segula, which is actually a translation of the work Exalted People. It was originally written in English. Rav Miller, I do not think, wrote it in Hebrew. It was translated in Hebrew, Exalted People. And he writes, based on the Midrashim and the Gemaras, and also the Doros Harishainim of the greatest of all Jewish historians, Rav Isaac Halevi Rabinowitz, the backdrop of the story of the War of Beitar. We know the War of Beitar began with, led by Bar Kochva. I think I slipped out in the drasha yesterday that in order to be a member of Bar Kochva's army, you had to prove your courage. How? By being able to chew off your thumb. If you were able to chew off your thumb, that means you had the requisite courage to be a member of the army of Bar Kochva. So you say, how many people did he get? A minyan, 12? He got 400,000 soldiers. At least. Probably more. At least four. He got 200,000. 200,000. The Chachamim told him, you're making the Jewish people Balei Mumin, and he said, well, how else am I supposed to test whether they're deserving soldiers? They said something like, well, have them ride on a horse, and if while they're riding they could uproot a cedar tree in one hand, then that would show their courage. So again, we're talking about a very powerful army. Okay, so Rav Miller, in the way he organizes the Sefer, this is chapter 13, and he has them organized by number. At the beginning of Hadrian's reign, he adopted a policy of seeking peace with various nations, which also meant the Jews had some respite. At this point in time, the Mesivta was in Usha, where it was for 5 years. The Abbezin was Rabbi Shua ben Chananya, Pappus, and Lilianus, who the previous Roman emperor was Quietus. Maybe he didn't talk by davening or something. And he sentenced Pappus and Lilianus to death. They're now set free by Hadrian. Also, at this point in time, we're talking about 50 years after the Churban, the Jewish people had a big settlement in Alexandria in Egypt, and the Greeks came along and destroyed the Jewish quarter in Egypt. And now Hadrian hears a court case of the Jewish people against the Greeks, and at this point in time, Rabbi Yeshua ben Chananya was the Av Bezdin. He had gone to Syria a number of times. The Gemara talks about, there's a Gemara in Chagiga. Did you in that Gemara, Shlomo? Chagiga, Hey Amid Beis, where Rabbi Yeshua ben Chananya went to Syria. Also B'chayrois, Ches Amid Beis, also in Chulin, Nun, Tes Amid Beis, and Samach Amid Aleph. And you could assume that if Rabbi Yeshua ben Chananya went to Syria, he was able to win over the favor of the various rulers. So, as we just learned, Hadrian went so far as to command the Jews to rebuild the Beis HaMikdash. You can imagine the excitement. Pappus and Lilianus were now freed. They're setting up these kiosks and money-changing operations so that the Jews could return. Now, the nations of the world, especially the Greeks of Sebaste and Soa, they were very disappointed because for the last 100 years the Greeks had tried to undermine the power of the Jewish people, and now they knew if that the Jewish people would return and rebuild the temple, what would happen is the Jews would gain autonomy and independence. So they wrote to Hadrian, bad idea, right? So, and Hadrian said, what am I supposed to do? I already gave my word. So they said, okay, just move the site 5 amos to the north or 5 amos to the south, which was obviously impossible. The Jews gathered where? In Beis Rimon. And they said we need to rebel, but Rabbi Shua ben Chananya was able to, so to speak, put the matter to bay. Rabbi Shua ben Chananya is acting as the main spokesperson for the Jewish people. Why? Because there's no Nasi. They can't appoint a Nasi. The Nasi is not mentioned. Why? Because there was no Nasi at the time. Look in 299. So, therefore, the prudent leaders of Klal Yisrael, headed by Rabbi Shua ben Chananya, were very far from any warlike ambition. So even though modern writers make the assertion that Rabbi Shua ben Chananya felt that rebellion, it was not ripe yet, no, it was a general dislike for any type of revolt. So Rav Miller says that a lot of modern writers write that at the Seder, the Chachamim that gathered in Bnei Brak were secretly plotting the Bar Kochva Revolt. Rav Miller says that's influence of modern thinking or secular ideas. The Haggadah says openly they gather together, L'saper b'yitzias Mitzrayim, nothing more and nothing less. Now, during this period of time, the Chacham were able to reestablish the Mesivta, which had been batel for 20 years. At the beginning of Trajan's reign, they forsook the Mesivta at Yavna. Okay, so 20 years earlier, the Mesivta was at Yavna. They had to abandon the Mesivta at Yavna. Now it's 20 years later. They didn't want to make the Mesivta in Yehuda. It would attract too much attention. So they went to the Galil. They went to Usha, where it had previously been in Usha. It went from Usha to Yavna to Usha. It was in Yavna earlier. It was in Usha earlier under the reign of Ram Gamliel. When Domitian was the brother of Titus. Domitian was the one who built the Arch of Titus in honor of Titus. In the last 20 years, when the Mesivta had been abandoned, the Chachamim wandered, they were scattered. Meanwhile, Ram Gamliel passed away in Lud. Rabbi Lezer ben Horkenes also passed away in Lud. Rav Tarfon passed away. Rabbi Lezer ben Azariah wanted to be moisif to the yeshiva, had to retire. You ever hear the expression Rabbi Lezer ben Azariah was in Beis Nitzeh. And then he went to Tzipori and he passed away. The only people left were Rabbi Yeshua ben Chananya. And someone who would ultimately be the accepted leader of the Jewish people, 50 years, Rabbi Akiva. Okay, so Rabbi Yeshua ben Chananya is the main spokesperson at the time, but Rabbi Akiva is about to step up and become the leader of the Jewish people. Rabbi Yeshua, take a look at number 302. The Mesivta was a necessity for the vitality of the Jewish people. So now 20 years later was the first time they were able to reestablish it in the beginning of Hadrian's reign. So after Nero, after Vespasian, after Titus, after Domitian, after Trajan, after Quietus, it's now the reign of Adarianos Caesar, Hadrian. Rabbi Yeshua ben Chananya is on his deathbed. Take a look. Look at number 302. Chazal say, Miyakim li'im, who's going to stand up against the evildoers now that you, Rabbi Yeshua ben Chananya, are passing away? Rabbi Yeshua ben Chananya was always the one who argued against the heretics. You know the famous Gemara in Chagiga, Shlomo, the famous Gemara in Chagiga. The Gemara says that Rabbi Yeshua ben Chananya went to the Caesar. By the way, the Caesar at the time was in Syria, Antiochia. So in the palace of the king, now by the way, Rav Miller points out, the disputes were always between the Chachamim and the Minim. The Minim were gross ignorami. However, it didn't matter because for the Caesar or the emperor, he wouldn't know any better. So the Chachamim, more than being erudite, had to be clever and had to be shrewd and answer the minim in a way that the Caesar or the emperor would buy their argument. So it wasn't a matter necessarily of scholarship as much as being clever and shrewd. So there's a famous Gemara in Chagiga, on Hayam and Beis, where the Gemara says a pantomime motioned to Rabbi Yeshua ben Chananya. He turned his back on him and he said, Ama da hadre mara ape mine, you're a nation that God has turned his face on you. So what Rabbi Yeshua ben Chananya motioned back? He stretched out his arm, as if to say, Oid yadai natuya, the outstretched arm of HaKadosh Baruch Hu is still outstretched to save us. So the ruler asked the two disputants to interpret each other's pantomime, and the min was not able to interpret the back and forth, and Rabbi Yeshua ben Chananya was able to, and the min was executed. So when Rabbi Yeshua ben Chananya passed away, the Gemara in Saita says the Mishnah says, Amem Tesam Abeis, Mishames Rabbi Shua ben Chananya, Batel, Eitza, Umachshava. Okay, so this was the backdrop. Now, Rabbi Akiva becomes the Av Bezdin, not the Nasi. Who is the Nasi? The Nasi was Reb Shimon Gamliel. He called himself, I'm the son of the Nasi, but he wouldn't assume the position as the Nasi. Let's read 303. Rabbi Akiva hechlifu ka'av bezdin shalom asifta. Rabbi Akiva assumes the role of the Av Bezdin. Hu haya ha'achroin me'roshei chazal asher haya pa'il b'Yavne. He was the last of the sages who was active in Yavne. Who else? Which other Tanoim were around? Rabbi Shmuel, who came to Usha. So that's why in Baba Basra and throughout Shas, Rabbi Shmuel is called Holchei Usha. Holchei Usha. So he went from Yavne to Usha. He was from the last of the Chachamim who was in Yavne. From Yavne he went to Usha. So whenever you say in Shas Holchei Usha, that's referring to Rabbi Shmuel. In any event, who else is active? Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, Rabbi Yossi Haglili, Rabbi Chalafta, Rabbi Chanina ben Tradion, Rabbi Elazar ben Perta. Now, out of fear of the Romans, they did not appoint a Nasi. Rishim Gamliel was protected by utilizing the title Ben Nasi, even though the Chachamim accorded him the honor of the Nasi. So during this second stint at Usha, they made the takanos in Usha, like B'Usha Heskinu Hamevazbeis Al Yevazbeis Yoser Michoimesh. You can't give away more than a fifth of your money. Maybe they needed to solidify the financial standing of the Jewish people. And all the takanos of Usha were the second time the Chachamim convened in Usha, and not the first time. The first time Ram Gamliel was alive, Rabbi Shua was alive. That's not when they were masakin the takanos in Usha. It's when Rabbi Akiva was at the helm as the Av Bezdin of the Jewish people. Okay, so now with this backdrop and Hadrian understanding that the Jewish people now 50 years later are a force to be reckoned with, he needs to figure out how to deal with them. And with this backdrop rises a man by the name of Bar Kochva. The reason why we're talking about it this week also is the source of Bar Kochva in the Chumash is the pasuk in this week's parsha. Darach Kochav Miyakov. Rabbi Akiva interpreted, it's referring to what we call Ben Koiziva or Bar Kochva, who is alluded to in that we have a tradition that Darach Kochav Miyakov was understood as the Melech HaMashiach. Darach Kochav Miyakov. And here he is, his name is Bar Kochva or Ben Koiziva. This must be the Mashiach. And who disagreed with Rabbi Akiva? Rabbi Yochanan ben Tairasa. Rabbi Yochanan ben Tairasa said, Akiva, you will die and grass will grow over your grave before this man is Mashiach. If you remember, we learned from Ramami Pano, Yochanan ben Tairasa was the Gilgal of Achashverosh. Okay, this is the backdrop for the upcoming Shir Wednesday night on the episode and the narrative and the beginning of Bar Kochva. Maybe, I don't know if we'll get to it this Wednesday night. Ultimately, we have to understand how Rabbi Akiva thought he was Mashiach, and as we know, Beitar was destroyed on Tisha B'Av itself. Have a good day, everyone. Bracha v'atzlacha. Shkoyach.